This presentation is for module Ways of Knowing, DBA program, module leader Dr. Olivier Rattle, paper presentation 1, and the subject is notion of paradigm. With respect to the designated task for this module's presentations, I will present to you the paper that's written by the author Rattle 2019 in the journal Study di Sociologica. This will be done in a method that takes into consideration the 3 supportive self-study recordings and also the handout slides. Title of the paper is Ambiguity and Polysemy as Rhetorical Resources in Knowledge Disputes. The struggles over the interpretation of Kuhn in organization studies. In order to understand this concept better, it is worth familiarizing with the notion of paradigm and the notion of incommensurability. These shall be discussed later. In the meantime, we should understand why the paradigm theory came about in the first instance. It was basically to answer a simple yet significant question of what is science? The notion of paradigm was introduced partly as a way of representing legitimate scientific activity because science confers cultural authority. For further reading on this, see handout slide 21 onwards. Olivier Rattle's article put Kuhn's interpretation of a paradigm at the forefront of the debate, and in this debate, established business management scholars and authors over time have contested, challenged, or even supported Kuhn's paradigm theory. Firstly, with respect to conceptual backgrounds, Self-Study Recording 1 looks at the origins of these concepts and where Kuhn's paradigm theory sits. Business-related social science theories are studied in the aim to provide a suitable language to understand a social phenomenon, such as Edward Lazare, Pierre Bourdieu, Thomas Guérin, Thomas Kuhn, and so on. What is the inspiration of Kuhn's paradigm theory? Well, for many years, theorists believe that history of science was linear, where accumulation of knowledge equates to rational progression. Kuhn, a physicist himself, changed this by proposing that scientific revolutions were cyclical and signaled major shifts in scientific understanding. You may wish to refer to slides 11 to 14 of handout slides for further information on this. Additionally, you may wish to watch a simple visual metaphoric clip that is illustrated on YouTube to aid the understanding. You can do this by using the following link. There are 4 sections of the study, Olivier 2019. The diversity of representational practices, the reception of Kuhn's notion in organization studies and in the social sciences, ambiguity as a rhetorical resource in knowledge disputes, and the usefulness of an arbitrary definition. Rattle seeks to methodically examine some usages of Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigm concepts and how these can inform future conceptualizations, as well as attempts made to delineate this concept by other authors. The notion of paradigm was introduced by way of serving the question, what does it mean to be scientific? The paper begins by looking at the work of organizational scholars. Burrell and Morgan, 1979, in this particular area, where the social theory-based 2x2 matrix model is conjoined to them. According to Self-Study 1, Recording 2, organizational studies scholars Burrell and Morgan look at the delineation of organizational studies in the larger context of management. They were the first to attempt this, hence the reason for why Rattle 2019 uses this as a good example in his paper. Burrell and Morgan say that their version of notion of paradigm was not borrowed from Kuhn, but inspired from Kuhn, as well as Jürgen Huberman's. The diagram demonstrates that the four paradigms for the analysis of social theory. Rattle 2019 puts into the check that actually the matrix schemes can be diverse and underpinned by different principles. It also mentions that from a sociological perspective, other authors have said that there's a congested number of analytical views due to the confusion in notion of paradigm with notion of perspectives, used loosely as a general term. So, rather than maligning Kuhn's theory, like Burrell and Morgan have, others, such as Ekberg and Hill, 1979, have embraced it to demonstrate its legitimacy in natural science. This is where the diversity of representational practices has been established. Now, we know that Burrell and Morgan themselves were heavy critics of Kuhn's work in the field of paradigm. Considering the reception of Kuhn's notion in organizational studies and in the social sciences at a wider perspective became appropriate. Authors such as Donaldson, 1985, were noticed in Rattle's article in order to answer two key questions. Question number one is, how did organizational scholars relate to Kuhn's work? And secondly, how did this compare to elsewhere in the social sciences realm? Donaldson claims that Burrell and Morgan's notion of paradigm is not aligned with Kuhn's work, as it's exaggerated. Burrell and Morgan make an assumption in their book to say that researchers make philosophical assumptions when approaching a topic, and in doing so, the topic becomes a subjective construct, which basically means that it exists in people's minds, but not visible until an interaction occurs. Donaldson rejected Burrell and Morgan's notion of paradigm incommensurability, which is basically assumptions made. Some criticised Donaldson for comparing inequivalent theories. Jackson and Carter, 1991, highlighted the differing ontological and epistemological views of both theorists. Others, such as Mason and Weingart, 2000, conducted content analysis and deduced the following. Kuhn's conceptual framework is applied limitlessly in deferring content to original intent. Kuhn's ideas are often taken at face value. Two opposing readings exist, the radical and the orthodox. Over time, Kuhn's intervention disappears. Kuhn's intervention fails. These points are supported in handout slide 35. Rattle, 2019, claims that Kuhn, over time, has changed some of his views in an important way. It's not precisely said how, though. Mason and Weingart suggest that Kuhn's concepts are metaphorical. Therefore, distortions are likely to occur, and as a result of this, some meanings become filtered and affixed, with the overall outcome seen as a knowledge resource rather than failing. This opens the next phase of discussion in the article, that is, ambiguity as a rhetorical resource. Despite many organizational scholars seeing ambiguity of concepts as a bad thing, the discussion converges towards the positives of Kuhn's ambiguity, where these misunderstandings are viewed positively. For example, as a strategic rhetorical resource, what can be achieved through its misuse. Transformations taking place thanks to occurrences of ambiguity. This demonstrates that paradigm is not a neutral term which can carry different meanings with different purposes. The definition of paradigm and its companion notion, incommensurability, can be seen as a site where intellectual struggles take place. Struggles for the definition of what counts as legitimate knowledge and what does not. Further analysis can be found in Self-Study Recording 3, where criticisms have been appropriated where other sociologists' views are looked at, such as Thomas Durian and Hazard and Cox. The recording even critiques its own paper, Rattle 2019, where Rattle highlights how Kuhn's theory is appraised as an orthodox and a heterodox reading. On page 24 of the paper, the usefulness of an arbitrary or subjective definition is discussed by way of two very clear illustrations. Illustration 1 is where Donaldson, 1995, wants to remediate theories of paradigm by unifying them. He proposes meanings of the following. Paradigms. He identifies 4 different Kuhnanian theories in his book, but deems them incomparable. These are population, ecology theory, resource dependence, institutional theory, and organizational economics. The other thing he proposes is incommensurability. The 4 theories are incommensurable paradigms in themselves, but this is assumed. Authors of the 4 theories do not relate much to one another, so there's little interconnect. And number 3, normal versus revolutionary science, where Kuhnanian theory is revolutionized by newer organizational theories, and these in themselves are paradigms representing revolutionary science. As for illustration 2, this focuses on McKinley and Mohn's 1998 publication, where ambiguity of concepts is seen as a problem. They claim that ambiguity of concepts used by organization presents an obstacle, thus the reason for persistent incommensurability. They also proposed that a dictionary definition approach to applying to a field-wide consensus is appropriate. This was so that the approach would have broader legitimacy, shared understanding of incommensurability. Classic sign of intellectual struggle in his field, like others, such as Donaldson, and they say that ambiguity is impossible to render. As McKinley and Mohn try to legitimize notions such as paradigm and incommensurability, Booth, 1998, is able to demonstrate that McKinley and Mohn apply these contradicting commendations because they themselves are relying on an arbitrary definitions of incommensurability in their work. Therefore, Rattle's paper settles with the point that McKinley and Mohn's project is an impossible one. Rattle, in his paper, concludes that we need to acknowledge that concepts are often ambiguous. This is not such a bad thing. At times, ambiguity can hamper the possibility of meaningful discussions. Ambiguity and polysemy distort the theoretical positions demonstrated by authors. And finally, Rattle concludes that the role played by ambiguity is recognized in the notion of paradigm in organizational studies. Overall, you may agree that Rattle 2019 is a thoroughly interesting read that addresses the aim of how the idea of paradigm is used in organizational studies and to what purposes. Now, in relating this presentation back to the task, as a following on group discussion, I ask you the primary question: is your work scientific? And what criteria are you using to ensure that your work is scientific or non-scientific. Thank you for listening. Looking forward to joining you on a discussion phase of this session.